Welcome to the show, everyone. Today's guest is Hannah Bottigheimer. Hannah is a Boston-based writer and former healthcare executive whose work explores motherhood, caregiving, mental illness, and family dynamics. A mother of four, her life changed overnight when her 14-year-old daughter developed psychosis and no longer recognized her. What began as a terrifying medical emergency became years of hospitalizations, uncertainty, and the complicated reality of serious mental illness. Through that experience, Hannah began writing about the long aftermath of psychiatric crisis and the way caregiving can slowly reshape identity, family, and everyday life. Her essays and reflections on resilience and reinvention have resonated widely online, where she publishes her newsletter, Private Acts of Disobedience. She is currently completing her memoir titled The Last Child. I'm excited to have Hannah on the show today to share her own story of resilience and bringing herself and her family back from the brink. And with that, Hannah Bottigheimer, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Eric. It's great to be here.
It is a pleasure to have you, my friend, as our guests will get to hear through our talk today. You and I have known each other for quite a long time, going back to those healthcare days back in, Best Doctors would have been in 2009 for me. I think you joined maybe a year or so before I did.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
so we've been fast friends since then. So it's a pleasure to have you on the show. And I've know parts of your story through our friendship and connection, and then of course seeing some of your and reading some of your writing material, and it is super inspiring, right? So I'm so excited to have you on the show to be able to share your story. So thank
Thanks.
you.
Yeah, no, I'm thrilled to be here. And as difficult a story as it is, it feels to me like a really good story and a story that I'm eager to tell to as many people as I can because there are just so many moments of despair and recovery and insights. So I'm looking forward to talking to you about some of those.
Yeah, for sure. Let's talk about life for you as a kiddo. So where did you grow up? What was your family experience like when you grew up? And you grew up in Long Island, I think, right?
Yeah, I grew up on Long Island, the child of academics. So I grew up in Stony Brook on Long Island, and there's a joke about there's a joke about Long Island where people talk about the town of Massapequa, which is not the town I grew up, but they call it Matza Pizza because the population of Long Island is so Jewish and Italian that Matza Pizza was sort of a
Oh, right.
catch-all for the general sort of cultural climate on
I
Long
was
Island.
almost immediately offended when you said that. I didn't know why, but I felt like I should take offense. I don't know.
Yeah, no, matzo pizza. I mean, I didn't grow, as I said, I
Just
didn't grow
kidding.
up there, but the Long Island that I grew up in was a very academic setting that was a mix of academics and families that had lived there for a long time. But my folks they were not originally from there. They were from Kentucky. So
Wow.
I used to accidentally say to people, I'm from the South too, which, I'm not really from the South, but my parents both grew up there.
Wow. In Kentucky.
hmm
And what brought them to Long Island?
It was the academic thing. So, I mean, years later, when I was making my own decisions about my professional life, there was a time when I really wanted to be an academic myself. And my folks discouraged me heavily. And they said that it was a shrinking industry. And the reason not to become an academic is that the jobs are so few that when they appear, you have to go to wherever they are. So for them, the job was on Long Island, and that's where they went. I don't think they really regretted it, but the feeling was it could have been anywhere. It could have been the middle of the country, it could have
Oh,
been a coast, it could have been any place.
do they work for university or?
Yeah, for Stony Brook University.
Okay, right on. And
Yeah.
then, so did they grow up in the South or were they just in the South
No, they
before?
both grew up in Louisville, and they coincidentally went to the same high school. They didn't know each other then, but they, had the same Latin teacher. And then they started dating when my dad was in college and my mom was still in high school.
Man, that had got to be, to go from the South to Long Island, right? It had to be a big shift, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting and this sort of touches on some of the things that are interesting about our friendship because you and I have joked for 15 years about our southern and northeast tendencies. And I know we like to tease each other about everything Texan and everything about us. What did you call me earlier? You northeast ladies.
Right.
So I think for them, they, in a lot of ways, kind of manifested that Northeast elitism view. So they felt that going from the South
Mm,
to the proximity to New York
yep.
was almost like a promotion culturally and intellectually. And so it felt, I don't think
It arrived.
I think they felt they'd arrived. In fact, I think it almost felt like what they described to my brother and me was that Stony Brook was the Berkeley of the East, which of course suggested we even knew what Berkeley was. But the idea was that it was a good thing
Yeah.
and that it was the East Coast version of a kind of open-minded, progressive, liberal, et cetera, everything that was important to them.
Right on. Interesting. Okay, so you and your brother there, you're getting ready to, you're like, I'm going to be going to university. I'm going to be an academic person myself. Was that the plan? Like you go off to
No, it
college?
wasn't really the plan. That I mean, that sort of that came a little bit later, more of a, you're 22, oh, what should I do? But there were a lot of ways in which my brother and I followed almost embarrassingly in our parents' footsteps, which is it's one of the things that I've been writing about besides the story about my daughter and her mental illness. I've been writing a lot of essays about generational inheritance. And I think I've shared some of those with you also. But uh, my parents had a pretty clear vision for what they wanted their children to do. And for a pretty long time, my brother and I were quite compliant. I mean, my dad went to school in the Northeast. My brother went to the same school. My mother went to a college nearby. I went to that same school. So it was, we were doing a pretty good job of mirroring the expectations that had been set out for us.
Right on. And did you get a master's? Did you go to Wellesley?
I went to Wellesley for my undergrad, and then I went to Brandeis for my master's degree.
Okay. So
Yeah.
Wellesley, yes.
Yes, all women, the Northeast ladies.
Oh, man, I've run past the Wellesley gals at the Boston Marathon.
Boston Marathon. Yeah, and they cheer, right?
They cheer. It's a wild, you can hear it from, well, you were not in that crowd, right? You never went to
No,
that
I
same.
went to the marathon. I mean, I went and watched when I
Right.
was in college. I didn't really understand because not being from Massachusetts, I didn't really understand what the marathon was locally. But I went. I went.
Yeah, yeah. It was, yeah, you could hear the screaming, the cheering from before you could see the people.
I think it's a real point of pride for Wellesley to really turn out and cheer for the runners.
Yeah, yeah. It was pretty cool. Yeah, I definitely remember it. Got some high fives along the bike racks there running by. It was pretty cool. It's fun. Okay, so you go to school, you get your undergrad, you progress, do you go immediately for your master's?
No, I took a few years I was a women's studies major at my all women's college. So
Oh,
uh, I
what does that prepare you for? Women's studies.
Well, and that's what everyone asked. It was, I'll tell you what it prepares you for, maybe becoming an academic. So it should start to become a little clearer why I might consider that. I remember going to, uh, there was an event at Wellesley that was maybe 5 years after I'd graduated, and I had no idea what you were supposed to do with a women's studies major. And I went to an event that was hosted at the college, and it was for women's studies graduates. And I thought, that's a reception. This is gonna be fantastic. I'm good. Finally, it's like the Holy Grail, finally it'll be revealed to me what I'm supposed to be doing. And it turned out that pretty much every alum that I met there was either in law school or had gone to law school, and I found that very disheartening because that wasn't what my future was. So it was around about then that I was kind of casting about, trying to figure out, would I teach? Would I get a PhD? And again, when you think about I think about this a lot. How do we know what we're supposed to do? We generally look up. You just see what your parents did, and you
Yeah.
either accept, reject that, whatever. In my case, I kind of explored it and was discouraged, and then it ended up going to a graduate program that essentially I was stalling for time. I didn't really know what I was going to do next,
Right.
but eventually it brought me. I mean, my passion had always been women's health, and so I moved into healthcare and. Gosh, I worked for startups. I worked for Athena Health. I worked for McKesson. Once I kind of got going into healthcare, then I mean that's when our paths crossed a few
Yeah.
years later. So
Yeah.
then it became pretty easy, although it wasn't really tied to women's studies. It really isn't a particularly useful professional degree, but it did allow me to think about things that are interesting to me.
Right. And I mean, when you're 18, what do you, it gives you a chance, that 4-year undergraduate degree, which I've had conversations on my show before about, when I went to school, so this would have been back in the 80s, it was a given like that you went to college because that's what you do when you have access and the availability to go is you want to go to college. It's going to lead to a better future, more
Mhm.
income, more stuff, right? More professional environment, et cetera. Now my view is different than that because I see you see like, oh my gosh, an undergraduate degree costs now $250,000 plus, and so you really need to get some ROI for that degree. If my own daughter or son came to me and said, "Hey, I want to get my general studies or my women's studies degree, and I'm going to pay $250,000,000," I'd be like, "You're out of your mind.
Yeah,
That's a
yeah.
bad idea." But then it was likely again, it was like, "Oh, I'm going to spend 4 years growing, maturing, learning about life, meeting people, figuring out how to be an adult."
It seems almost ridiculous to me now, honestly. I mean, it seems privileged and uh, luxurious, but and not particularly. I mean, I love where my life has taken me, so I don't want to suggest that it
Yeah,
wasn't a great thing for me, but I think it was very privileged. And also being a child of academics, it was encouraged.
yeah,
So to really explore, your ideas and the notion of looking at history through the lens of gender, that was very interesting to me. It just wasn't very practical.
mm,
It would have been practical if I had been about to become an academic, but otherwise, not especially. And I mean, if one of my kids wanted to do that, I for sure wouldn't encourage
yeah,
them. So,
right, right.
you know,
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, we could talk a lot about because to me when I was 18, I never dreamt like, oh, I think a good thing to do would be to get a trade, like become a tradesman. Now I think it's a great idea. I think it's
right.
you can make you can have a nice living. You can I think it's unlikely to be eliminated by technology or AI anytime soon. So I think there can be really good pathways there that didn't exist 30 years plus ago. When we were I think, well, they existed, but it just wasn't for whatever reason emphasized. And but I'm definitely take a different view on that now. But it's interesting. Okay, so you're in healthcare now, so you're doing the healthcare thing. Talk about so you're a professional. You're kind of moving from different startups in healthcare. Are you married at this point? Have you
Yeah, I was
come up?
married,
Yeah,
I was married and I had my first kid. And so I have four kids and I was always working. I think from our long friendship that I sometimes think of myself as an accidental careerist, which is to say, I didn't have a ton of professional ambition, but my personal life was such that, I was married for 20 years, and for most of that time, I was the sole provider for our family, which required that I lean into my professional identity and competence in a way that I hadn't really planned on. I didn't, as I say, I didn't have a different plan, but I didn't have an ambition. I think, and that's probably one of the most interesting things to me to see at this point in my life how, I worked all those years. I was competent I mean, we worked together. I think I was competent, right? I
You're
mean,
very competent. Yeah. Super.
I felt like I knew what I was
Yeah.
doing, but I didn't have a ton of ambition behind it. And that was part of the accidental careerist. I sort of fell into becoming capable because I was required to do so because my then husband wasn't working. Um, but I guess maybe it's not right to say I didn't have ambitions because I did have ambitions of having a family. And in order to fulfill those kind of dreams, it became necessary for me also to be working,
Yeah.
and supporting our family.
So yeah, wow. So you're doing both things. Okay, so you're the breadwinner in the home. You're working at a high level, traveling a lot, all of that, and you start having kiddos. So you have your son was your oldest, right?
Mhm.
And then your daughter.
Yeah.
Trying
I
to
don't
track
expect
the
there are
ages,
so
right?
many. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
now between Nick and me, we have 7 kids, so I don't expect anyone. I barely remember, who's on first. But yeah, so I had 3 kids in close succession.
Yeah.
My first three, Daniel, Jessica, and Nicholas, and they were, I was in those early years when you have three under four, and working, juggling everything. And this next part, the part about sort of figuring out, well, when are you done? When is your family complete? That's a question that lots of couples face. And uh, for Peter and me, it was a real dilemma because he was 11 years older than me. And so he'd been a little bit, he was 40, I think, when we had, maybe he was 41 when we had our first child. And after those 3 kids were, they were coming along, maybe 5, 3, and 1 or whatever. And I just really wanted to have another child.
Yeah.
And we weren't on the same page about it. We didn't feel the same. And, we both had equally reasonable arguments. His feeling was he was 50, was a little old to become a parent again. And that he was right about that. I mean, that was a reasonable objection. But we also had friends of ours, a couple where the wife had wanted more children and the husband hadn't supported it, and it had become a source of tension between them over the years. And as couple friends, it was something we talked about openly. And Peter really didn't he didn't want to be the husband that whose wife resented him for not permitting her to have the family that she wanted. And so, we went back and forth, and there's a big gap actually between my first three and my last child, Sarah, because I was in my mid 30s. I expected everything to just keep working as it had before.
Yeah.
But once we arrived at the decision that we would have another child, I had a series of pregnancies that didn't work out. And with each miscarriage, I think Peter felt like, well, okay, so now that it's a sign,
Alex.
that means like obviously we need to give this up. And I didn't interpret it the same way. I saw it as, well, we're getting closer,
Yeah.
just keep trying, perseverance.
Right.
And so, I was just really determined. And I mean, how does a couple compromise on whether you have another child or not? But eventually, we had the last child, my daughter Sarah, who was born 5 years after my third kid. And you know, I sometimes look at I sometimes look at my life sort of before and after getting what I wanted.
Uh,
It's tempting sometimes to reduce it to like a Greek mythology and say, well, this is the story of Icarus flying too close to the sun, or being overreaching and having ambitions that are greater than what a mere mortal can tolerate. And that I don't know, it's tempting when things go very badly and everything backfires to kind of project onto it a morality tale as if there has to be a story that explains why things go sideways. And it's been part of my journey is sort of trying to unravel what do I think anything means and how do I make sense of the surprises and the unexpected twists and turns that have been part of our lives since Sarah arrived.
Yeah. Tell me your faith life. So does that play a part in all in the story for you at all?
Well, it's an interesting question because it kind of ties back to what we were talking about before about my parents who take great pride in their identity as intellectuals. And so, intellectuals, as you probably know, well, maybe not all intellectuals, but the ones I grew up with definitely reject spirituality as irrational.
Yeah.
And also, they had what was in the 50s referred to as an interfaith marriage because my dad is Jewish and my mom was Quaker. And so I grew up thinking that I was the product of an interfaith marriage. But as I've gotten older, I've realized that their interpretation of interfaith was anti-faith. So, so I think that um, their response to being from different religious backgrounds was to kind of reject pretty much all spirituality. I mean, I know that sounds like a sweeping generalization, but that's my recollection of how I was raised. So I wasn't raised with a lot of spirituality. So that wasn't a resource that was available to me when in times of crisis.
Yeah. Did that ever change for you over time? Because the notion or the question around why did this happen for me or to me or why did I go through a struggle? That's a human question, right? That I think we all grapple with at some point. And for me, a faith life has become this just solid rock and this anchor in my life, and 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 yet it's still a question that comes up like, oh my gosh, why did I have to deal with this? Or why did this challenge happen? Why did this happen to me and not happen to this other person or whatever? And yet faith is the thing that always brings me back home to, okay, I understand that difficult things happen in the world that we live in. Many people deal with far greater difficulties than I'm dealing with. How can I take this difficulty and reflect it out to the world in a positive way? How can I take this struggle and use it
Yes.
for good?
Right. Well, which is actually sort of the framework of the hero's journey, right? Which
Yes.
is to, you know, take a trial or a setback or an adversity and navigate one's way through it and then return or sort of experience a rebirth that allows you to understand your condition and help others understand their condition as well. So I think, I mean, faith wasn't available to me, but I think that a lot of what got me through some of our hardest times was, well, I think during the worst of our times, and we can talk about this in a minute, but some sort of our suffering, my suffering was when Sarah became seriously ill. The greatest suffering came in the form of a feeling of isolation, a sense of being alone and not feeling connected to others, a sense that the hardship and that we were facing and that I, as her mother, was carrying. And also I was divorced by this time. So there was a special kind of aloneness of um, you're the parent of this child who's really unwell. You don't know what her future looks like, and consequently, you don't know what your future looks like. And because of the divorce, there was a very, it was sort of inescapable how Sarah really was my responsibility. So even though, I had repartnered and I have a wonderful husband who couldn't be a better stepfather to Sarah, the fact of the matter was, I was the biological parent and I was the only one who was really ultimately going to be responsible for her. So the sense of aloneness uh, was really painful. And eventually, uh, it was my understanding of that I was not the only person who had ever experienced something like this, that there were other parents and other families that had confronted a family member with serious mental illness and were looking at lifelong consequences in ways that, if they weren't exactly the same as mine, they were similar. And that understanding of our common humanity, I think, is a really important part of spirituality. So even though I didn't have a faith to tie it to, I think that's such an important element of community and spirituality and a sense of belonging and being, part of a community. So eventually I got that, but just not through a conventional way.
Yep, I'm with you. Okay, so I want to move to Sarah's story. And you mentioned that she is 5 years younger than your next in line child, right? So which would be your son, Nicholas?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And so talk about, so Sarah, your kids, I know from, again, my experience or my recollection was they're sporty, they're engaged, they're doing all sorts of stuff, they're growing up. I think when we met, Sarah would have been very young, I'm pretty
Yeah,
sure.
too.
Probably.
I think she
Okay.
was.
Yeah, a
Mhm.
couple years old. So what was life like for your kids, raising your kids?
Yeah.
Talk about family life and raising your
Oh
kids.
gosh, I mean, we had a great family. We had so much fun. I mean, in a lot of ways, my dream of having a big family was fulfilled. It was just my brother and me growing up, and my family was very serious, and that I often felt a sense of not belonging in my own family because I wanted to have more fun, and it just wasn't. My family's great, but they weren't that much fun. I wanted to have fun.
Pretty serious, yeah.
And so it was almost like I built a team. I was married to someone who was athletic and sporty, and we had these wonderful kids. They were so close with one another, and they played sports. And I almost had a completely different experience as a parent than I'd had as a child. I got to actually experience a lot of what I had yearned for as a kid. So, the kids were playing soccer and basketball and hockey, and my daughter Jessica was a dancer. And so the kids they were 5, 7, and 9 when Sarah was born, which in a lot of ways meant that Sarah became like a mascot for our family. She was so much younger. And so it was almost as if she had 5 parents because the other kids were all taking care of her. And I mean, and I sometimes hear this about Irish families where once the family gets big enough, the parents kind of fall back a little bit and the kids sort of take up
Take
some of the
over.
slack. And it wasn't entirely like that, but my daughter Jessica in particular did a ton of heavy lifting. She was sort of my second mom. She was
Right
always
now.
there, really, really helpful. But Sarah from birth had some health issues, physical health issues that were, each one of them by itself didn't seem like that big a deal, but you put them all together and maybe worrisome, but that's not how I'm wired. I'm not a worrier. So, it's one of these things where again, you look back and you go,
Yeah.
did I like
What was
like
I thinking, right? I
and
missed.
also, like, what was I thinking in the first place? And second of all, there's a kind of embarrassing um, feeling of, did everybody else see something that I didn't see? And actually, a good friend of mine, her name's Judy, she recently texted me. Can't imagine what compelled her to give me this moment of radical candor at this particular point in time. She said, uh, Hannah, we all knew something was up, and you're the only one who didn't. And that hurt. I mean, it hurt, but it also was like everything else. How do you interpret it? I mean, I'll tell you my two interpretations. My negative interpretation is like, what kind of idiot mom was that? So blind. Also working full time, traveling, busy, just
Yeah.
it didn't serve me to over-index on is my kid not well.
Yeah.
It served me better uh, to just, these are growing pains, she's a
Right.
little quirky, something to
Yeah.
get different kids. My more positive interpretation is that my blindness to my daughter's challenges sometimes to me looks like the power of love. That when you love someone so much, you don't you don't see those things. So it depends on the day, like how I'm inclined to interpret it. Most days I'm more in that former camp of like, how did I miss what everyone else saw? But I don't think it's all bad because I didn't raise her as if I thought anything was wrong. I raised her just the same as every other kid.
Right. Right on. Can you recall anything now, like in those early signs that you were like, oh, it's just a quirky thing for a kid, anything that
Oh,
shows up?
sure. I mean, so I'll tell you a couple of them because you'll see how benign they were. Like she had something called esotropia, which is, um, it's called lazy eye. So like one of her eyes would sort of drift out of focus and they weren't always totally aligned. So she had to have a corrective surgery. But it's like
Yeah.
your eyes are out of alignment, not that big a deal.
Yeah.
There were a couple other, I'm trying to remember what the other things were. But they were all sort of minor. Now, when you and I worked together at Best Doctors, it was around that time that her pediatrician suggested that she might have had a stroke in utero, and that was something that could explain. She had some delays and like she didn't crawl at the time when everyone else crawled. She wasn't meeting the milestone markers. Again, delays. Like
Yeah.
not every kid, one of my kids walked at 10
Common.
months, one at 13 months. By the time you're fourth kid, you're kind of like, why is everyone fixated on these milestones?
Right. Yeah.
So, so then we did a whole investigation into whether or not that was something that could explain it. And it was inconclusive. And as far as I was concerned, everything was inconclusive. And I kind of didn't want to, I just wasn't that invested in attaching to the idea that there was anything not right.
Yeah.
So, um, I kind of look at my kids as I had these four great kids, but it is absolutely true that the fourth kid was very different from the first three.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. I heard somebody say one time, this notion of reading at level or above level. It's like, what are we doing when our kids are, it's like,
Right.
oh, you have a sixth grader. They're not reading at the sixth grade level. They're at the fourth or fifth grade level. You want to say, are you reading at the 45-year-old level? I don't think you're not quite there. You're reading only like the 42-year-old level and you
Right.
need to up your game. And so some of the measuring of some of that stuff, I think when kids are little, it can stress a parent out because I know there's a lot of parents that would freak out about that, like the whole idea of, oh, they're not crawling fast enough or walking fast enough or early enough or at the right time or they're not reading. With our son, so our daughter Madeline was first, our son James was second. Madeline was reading, I think, as she exited the womb, she was, reading books to us. And so when James came along and we're reading to him and then we're expecting him to read back the way Madeline had, he wouldn't, he would look at the book and he would make up a story from the picture, not read the
Right.
words on the page. And, being a great dad that I was, I would scold him for that. Like, son, you're not trying.
Right. Sound it out.
You sound it out. You're not even, you're making words up now. Like, what
Right.
are you doing?
Right.
And, come to find out he has dyslexia. He can't see the letters are all jumbled. He can't see it. So, and then you freak out like, oh my gosh, my child has this thing now. He's not going to be able to read. He's not going to be able to thrive. And of course, he overcame all of that through some extra coursework and whatever, some special, what do they called it? Accommodations
Right.
and a program that he went through and all these things. But yeah, this whole idea of that we have to be on the same path. And if you're not on that path, then there's something to be worried about. I think there's a lot of, and we went through it, of like, oh my gosh, what does this mean for him? And it meant really in the big picture, nothing, he's just
And
fine.
I think also the other reason for my kind of oblique attention to it was in part a rejection of that academic upbringing where there's so much
Mm.
emphasis on academic achievement and how smart you were and how many awards and trophies. And I never really was on board with that value system. That said, you'd like your kids to pass their classes, you'd like them to be able to
Right,
read,
right, right,
you'd
right.
like them to be able to graduate from
Yeah,
high school.
yeah,
You just don't want to be a maniac about it. So by the time Sarah came along, the my other three kids were all, I mean, they were probably technically gifted, but I wasn't really that focused on it. It wasn't a source of concern for me. So when Sarah was a little different and not things weren't coming as easily to her, I just had a view of, everyone does stuff in their own time,
right.
and she got, like James, she got accommodations and, extra support and maybe pullouts for reading or whatever. But again, that wasn't part of my experience before, but it seemed like a lot of people had that. And, okay, that's just how it's going to be.
Yeah, right on. Okay, so then let's move forward a little bit in Sarah's story and your story, or to this maybe the first episode when something really goes, haywire or sideways, where you're like,
Yeah.
what's going
So,
on?
so that's fast forward probably 10, 12 years. So, I mean, I described this really, it was a great family. And the kids were all generally thriving, except for Sarah had these, delays. But my marriage was not thriving. And when I left my husband, it was right around the time that my older three kids were leaving for college. And they kind of went, because they were so close, like boop, boop, boop. And as they were leaving, my marriage was sort of disintegrating. And then, you know, she was doing okay with it, but then there was a big change, maybe a year, well, it actually might have even been 3 years after Peter and I split, where I had become involved with someone else, my now husband. I like to call him my current husband,
It's
just to keep
good.
him on his toes,
Keep them loose. Yeah, exactly.
And when we set up house together, that was the beginning of a lot of change for Sarah. So first of all, I think she was 12 or 13. Her three older siblings, who again were practically parents for her, so they had all just left for college. Her dad was no longer living with her, obviously. We moved in with Nick, my husband, and his children, who, it was a big adjustment for everyone, but I think it had a big impact on Sarah. So your family's changed. You leave the house you grew up in, you move to another town, you have a new like father figure. Your actual dad lives several towns away. He's remarried. And you've got these quasi step siblings who are not interested particularly, certainly not like the real siblings. Um, so, I talked earlier about a feeling of isolation. And then you've got a mom who's still working full time, traveling for work, and good luck, kid.
Yep.
Like that was a lot.
Yep.
And, it's really surprising to me, given what ended up happening, that she didn't fall apart sooner. So, long story short, she started at a new school, made it through seventh grade and half of eighth grade, um, with some bumps. Like she wasn't doing great, but again, I just attributed it to these are adjustments. However, um, in the middle of eighth grade, she went to bed one night, the daughter that I knew, woke up in the middle of the night, um, saying that she had a brain bleed, that her lungs were collapsing, that the cancer was back. She said I needed to take her to the hospital to get a CAT scan. And by morning, she no longer recognized me. She thought that I was Dr. Ellis Gray from Grey's Anatomy, who is the mother of Meredith Grey and is, I think, if not an evil character, she's a bad mother. And so Sarah no longer recognized me and continued to insist that something was really wrong with her. She actually, I mean, so she was 14 at the time, and she got into bed with me in the middle of the night and was just so agitated with this, we have to go. Um, has the ambulance come yet? Just very, the kind of thing that is so outlandish that you can only conclude it's a bad dream or
Right.
like a night terror. My kids never had night terrors, but maybe that's what this is. You don't know. You've never seen this before. Eventually, she fell asleep. When she woke up in the morning, she looked at me and I said, "So you made it through?" And she said, "Made it through what? Have you called the ambulance yet?"
Oh,
So that was the beginning. Um, I still didn't know what was going on. I called her pediatrician and described what happened. And the pediatrician asked me, "Is there a reason you haven't taken her to the hospital?"
mm,
Which, again, I mean, now that you've heard my story about how I apparently underreact to everything, I was a little taken aback because the reason I didn't take her to the hospital was because it was preposterous. I knew that her lungs weren't collapsing, but there was no way she was having a brain bleed or that none of those things made sense to me.
yeah,
But I didn't have a category for imagining a condition in which she had become disconnected from reality. And I certainly I didn't have a word for it, and didn't imagine that that was ever going to be part of Sarah's experience or ours.
man. So, and it's interesting that the doctor would say, is there a reason you didn't take her? And like, I love what you said about none of it made any sense. I
Right.
think also, I mean, for me, as I sit here and listen to your story and try to put myself in your shoes, it would be terrifying, right? That those are the words that you're hearing from your child. But then it's almost like when you go to the doctor or the hospital, it's almost giving into it or admitting like there's really a
Right.
problem here
Yes.
versus this can't be a problem, which is how I would react too. Like, this is fine. We don't need to go to the doctor. We're just going to figure this out because my brain can't comprehend that this is really something you're feeling or
Right.
believing. It's just
Definitely. I
something.
remember a time, this was a number of years ago, when you were on some work call and I don't know where Karen was, but James, it feels like
Oh
he
my
fell down
gosh.
a ravine or something. And you said he's just scratched up his leg, but it was like, I mean, he was so hurt.
Oh
And
man.
you were this, I mean, I don't want to say the same as me, but you didn't have time for James to have like a medical
Yeah.
emergency.
Yeah. He said he called me, and this was early cell phone. This was pre-iPhone, like one of the Motorola phone type of thing, which he did not have. So he borrowed some friend. Somehow he got a hold of a phone and he called me, and I answered because you didn't screen calls then. And you just answered everything, right? So I answered this hello, and he's like, hey, Dad, it's James. I'm like, James, what's happening? Where are you? He's like, oh, I'm down the street. And he used a word. My kids are readers, so they use big words, right? So, and he was a little guy, probably 8 or 9, something. Yeah, he would have been like 9 years old. And he said something like, he used the word, I can't even think of a good word now, but something about I mangled my leg,
Mangled. Yeah, I
mangled
think
it.
it was mangled.
I mangled my
Yeah,
leg. And he sounded very calm, and his voice was, there was no screaming or, crying. So I'm like, he didn't mangle his leg. That's just
right.
a word that he's chosen. So I'm like, son, I'm on some calls, and where are you? I'm down at the creek, down at the end of the street. Okay, I'll be down in a little bit. So like a half hour later, I meander down there, and the kid's leg is like bleeding from the hip to the
Wow.
ankle, and I'm like, "You mangled your leg? Like, what is this? Why didn't you say?" He's like, "I told you, mangled my
Right.
leg." Yeah,
Well,
that
I,
moment,
I
the
mean,
worst father ever.
worst mother ever. I mean, I think there are so many elements of this story and this experience with Sarah that of course, expanded to be a much bigger story, but it's a story that many parents can relate to, if not having their children become psychotic overnight, having a moment of self-doubt around their parenting response or instincts, and then later reflecting on it with some, you know, self-recrimination because in order to be functional parents, we can't engage with everything. It's
Right.
just hard to know which things are the real things. And when your kid is being quite literally crazy, you're not thinking you need to take them to the hospital. And I'll tell you, what's interesting is I did take her to the hospital. This happened on a Thursday night. I took her on Friday. She was evaluated, which it was the first time I'd never learned about this, but I didn't know about it before. But when there's something off with the kid, they will do it. They just call it a psych eval. But she was had a psychiatric evaluation, and we were sent home that night. So that same day, we came home, and by the next morning, she was still not herself, and she wanted to see her dad. And I told Peter everything that was going on, and I was kind of relieved actually because I wasn't able to stabilize her. Again, we still didn't have the word psychotic. She'd been cleared, everything was fine, fine enough that I'd taken her to the emergency room. A bunch of doctors had seen her and said, high anxiety. It's
Okay.
she's just high strung.
Yeah.
Sometimes we see this with kids.
Teenage girl.
Teenage girls, I mean, they didn't say this explicitly, but there was a sense that, kids see a lot of what other kids post.
Mm.
Maybe they over index on their dark thoughts, but she was okay. Everyone said she was okay. But by the next morning, she went to her dad's and she really wasn't acting like herself. By Sunday morning, she was telling him that she didn't want to eat anything. She accused him of putting gasoline in her pancakes. She was looking for her stepmother in the wood pile out back, which when he told me that, the gasoline was not good, but looking for her mother in the wood pile, it made
Yeah.
no sense. And we ended up doing another evaluation and they cleared her. But by later on Sunday, when she was back with me, she was uh, decompensating so quickly that I sometimes look back. I mean, I remember that day very clearly because we were just trying to get her back on track and normalize what was clearly abnormal behavior. But she eventually uh, ran out of the house in the rain to a nearby elementary school, was swinging on a swing set. I was at that point where she wasn't even recognizing me. It was almost like, do I got to get the dog catcher? Like, how am I gonna in the rain, a kid that's
Running
out
down the
of mind,
street.
and I don't, and running down the street, so many safety concerns. It's a miracle to me that I got her back to the hospital. But once I did, and we went back to that St. Children's Hospital in Boston, so that was on the Sunday, she didn't come home again for, it was a long time. She was in the emergency room for 2 weeks in the emergency room because, right away, well, I mean, right away, the second time, so maybe not right away, it took him a couple days, but by the end of the weekend, it was evident to the doctors that she was psychotic, that she'd completely disconnected from reality. But what was unclear to them, and unclear to me because I didn't know anything about this at the time, was that they were looking at possible causes as being medical in nature because it's so unusual for a person to just flip a switch like that overnight. And it really was like that with Sarah. It was like, good night, everyone. And then middle of the night, the lungs. Uh, so when it happens that quickly, there's suspicion of that it could be an underlying medical explanation or it could be a traumatic response,
Mm.
which then raises all kinds of triggers and flags about, has this kid been assaulted? Is there sexual abuse, sexual assault? So, of course, I know none of this. I don't understand what's happening. We're in the emergency room. But meanwhile, I'm under suspicion. The stepdad boyfriend is under suspicion. Her father, and I'm being, I don't want to say interrogated because that's a very strong word, but asked a lot of questions about what do I suspect is going on for my kid? And
I don't know.
I don't know. Like you're the doctors.
Yeah.
What do you
You
think's
asking me for?
going on?
Yeah.
Seriously. It was really rough.
And so you don't realize that that the questioning is like part of their like I said, interrogation. They're like, hey, we got to figure out, and I assume they were asking Peter, they're asking Nick
They're
questions.
mostly asking me because,
Okay.
I'm the mom and I think
So they weren't trying to catch you all three in a lie, like asking each
I didn't get
other
that
the
sense.
same
I
question.
think the sense I got was they they kind of approached it through a side door, like explaining to me, well, it could be something neurological, it could be encephalitis, or it could be uh, a response to an immunization, like all these sort of far-fetched edge cases where the way you find that out is do a spinal tap or like these very invasive things where I didn't think any of those like I just didn't you
Oh,
remember from Best Doctors like when you hear hoofbeats, look
think
for
horses,
horses.
not
Don't look for
zebras,
a zebra. It's not a zebra.
right?
I didn't go to med school, but even I know
I remember that one. Yeah.
it's probably not that. But then when they were asking me about they were explaining, well, it could be a traumatic response. And did I think there was any trauma? Which, of course, I didn't think there was any trauma. But, eventually I realized that I was almost being asked not to finger uh, my ex-husband, but th do you think that's possible? And, because we've been friends for a long time, I had a lot of problems in my marriage, but I never, ever, ever believed that Peter was responsible for what was happening with Sarah. And eventually I mean, you never get like technically cleared, but it's not like the heat kind of subsided a little bit on that line of questioning.
Yep. 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 Are they, so at this point, have they put her on a lot of medication to sort of to bring her into
Yeah.
a state of like calmness? What was that like? What was their
Yeah.
protocol?
So what it was like was that paranoia and delusional behavior was so acute that we couldn't even really get her into one of the emergency room bays because the the medical equipment, those gurneys, they're made by well, I can't remember who the other maker is, but the one in this emergency room, they're made by Hill-Rom. And Sarah read that as kill room. And
Mm,
she wouldn't go, she was like a talk about a horse. She was rearing up like you don't put me in there. They're gonna kill me in there. So that's how, pronounced it was. They did give her sedatives and antipsychotics that slowed her down considerably, but they didn't explain that the change in her affect was the result of the medication. As far as I knew, this was my new daughter who was listless, blank-eyed, could barely play a game of Yahtzee, really couldn't. She became so low functioning. And I didn't know that was the medication. I just thought it was the progression of whatever was happening was,
right.
you know,
This was the new, or the current. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Um, so are they at this point? You talked about her being in the emergency room for 2 weeks, or 2 weeks and then a long
yeah,
stay in the hospital.
yeah.
So you're
Oh,
you're
two
you're
weeks because there was a shortage of inpatient beds at adolescent psychiatric facilities, and that was the next step was for her to go. They said for a short term, you know, typically 10 to 14 days was the typical acute stay. And that's what they anticipated, but it was 2 weeks until we could even get to a hospital. And I wrote about this actually recently on LinkedIn. Part of what was so mind-boggling about that experience was there didn't seem to be a system at all. And the social workers and staff at the hospital were telling us to work our networks. Um, and basically um, mount a campaign of everyone we knew to see who could connect us to an inpatient hospital, which I mean, seemed ludicrous. I I believe and hope that it's changed since then. It wasn't that long ago, but it was like use your connections to get an inpatient bed. Anyway, so she did get to a hospital and she wasn't there for 2 weeks. She was there for 7 weeks, which was just really a huge shock for all of us. I mean, it was a time when, every day things just kept getting a little worse than the day before. And after a while, you kind of get some fatigue around thinking that things are going to get better because they're not getting better at all. They just keep getting worse.
Yeah. At this point, is there concern for her harming herself, or was that ever a thing?
No, interestingly, so she moved through a spectrum of expressions of mental illness. And so the first stage, I guess I'd have to say the first stage, like psychosis, was uh, that disconnection from reality, paranoia. It wasn't just the gasoline and the pancakes that day. She stopped eating. She probably lost 30 pounds in that 9 week period because she was too afraid to eat. So that was the first way that it showed up. Then she came home that spring and she was home for most of the summer. But in the fall of that same year, this was 2021, um, she began to destabilize a second time. And it started with self-harm. So, words I've learned, safety. There were always safety concerns with her. And then the third stage and she really sort of moved through these stages because once she moved into I mean, this is like a terrible roadmap. Like I don't want anyone to ever follow this roadmap, but went from the delusions to self-harm and then moved through that to physical aggression with others. And
Mhm.
so it just, as I say, kept getting worse. And it was, you know, so this is my baby, right? So she's my youngest, Shirley Temple, blonde curls, so adorable, like the cutest, sweetest, most lovable kid. And first, she doesn't recognize her own family, and she is living in a world where she believes that she's a spy, that people are trying to harm her, even in the hospital. Then you move to that's pretty bad, right? Like that's terrible. You feel really bad for your kid. You really want her for that stage to pass. And then you think that's about as bad as it can be, but it turns out it can get worse.
Yeah.
So then when your kid begins to self-harm, that's a whole nother stage where, again, this isolation, which I mean, I've learned so much. There's so many parents and families that, I mean, I learned how common this is, but it didn't seem common to me. It seemed like the horror of knowing that your child is in such a place of distress that they take satisfaction from seeing their own blood. It's just really disturbing. And part of the coaching that you get as a parent is that you're supposed to be non-reactive. You're supposed to like act like that's normal. You're not supposed to give a big response to that. So, okay, you try to do that, but still your kid has to go to the hospital because it's dangerous. And if they're talking about more serious self-harm or suicidal
Yeah.
thoughts, urges, then they definitely have to be in the hospital. And then when they move into, and so you think that's pretty bad. And then when they become physically aggressive and require physical restraints and sedating injections because of
Mm.
all the chaos, it's just, you just can't even believe it. I mean, even talking about it now, it's so unbelievable. And yet, I'm not the only parent. Sarah's not the only kid. Serious mental illness is a lot more common than I ever understood. And now I have that feeling of, do you remember when, before you had kids, did you ever have any friends who had kids ahead of you? And it was kind of annoying how their lives totally revolved around their kid. And then you had a kid,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden you realized what a bad friend you were because you didn't understand. That's how I have felt with this is um, kind of humbled by what a privileged life I led before when I didn't know anything about mental illness and I didn't have a reason to. And honestly, I didn't really want to because it just, that, I don't know, sounded like not something I wanted to know more about. And then you have a kid.
Right. Yeah.
And it's very, um, it's really painful. And you can remember what you felt like before you were in this world. And you can imagine that's how everyone else feels, but it's different now because it's you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, That was a really big kind of transformation.
Yeah. So, thinking about the stress of what you're going through while she's going through um, uh, her, her health challenges, health crisis she's in. How are you managing your life, right? So, and I would think, and it's not a stretch to say, things like this have a way of tearing apart marriages, tearing apart, ruining, ending careers, like, because it's how do you continue to function? How do you not take out anger, resentment, fear on those that are close to you, be they coworkers or, you know, um, fiancés or, all these things, your own kids. So how are you managing through this is one thought that comes to mind. Yeah, I'll leave it there for now. And yeah.
Well, so, I struggled a lot. My my older, so I think the places where I think about, well, what was affected? So relationships with your family. I think I leaned on my older kids and required them to function more independently because I was so consumed by caring for Sarah. And just like everything, I think in some ways we remained close, but I think they just understood that I didn't have that much capacity to be present for them. It's something that I feel bad about, but it's also, I feel it's forgivable and I feel forgiven by them, and we only gradually now, actually, as I've been writing the book, sometimes we have conversations about, do you remember this night? And do you remember that? And how was that for you? Um, but they were very generous. Uh, with Nick, who's my husband, not to be confused with Nick, my son, it is confusing. Um, you know, he and I had he and I had gotten engaged 3 months before Sarah's first episode of psychosis.
Wow.
And we were, honestly, we were already in a period of some crisis because there was so much chaos in our blending of families. So I mentioned earlier, I have 4 kids, he has 3 kids. There was a lot of friction around bringing everyone together. I think the friction had subsided enough that it felt like an okay moment for him to propose to me. And we had been together 6 years at this point. So I may have been getting a little antsy about, is this ever going to
What are your
happen?
intentions here, fella? Right.
Yes, exactly. Although equally candidly, the friction of bringing our families together had diminished my urgency a little bit.
Mm.
So I definitely saw Nick as my life partner, but my urgency around marriage had kind of cooled a little bit around the time he proposed. Again, I adore my husband. He's the best, but the complexity of our family life before this happened with Sarah was already pretty high.
Yeah.
So when Sarah unraveled in March, 3 months after he'd proposed, initially I just thought, this is a terrible thing that's happening, but it's going to have a beginning and an end. And I'm really probably because of my professional life, like, okay, we've got a problem, we're going to solve it, we're going to fix it, and then we're going to dust ourselves off and move on. I never ever considered that what was happening for Sarah was the beginning of our new life and a chronic experience that would totally change the way I defined my life, viewed my future, saw my identity. I didn't see it as that. I just saw it as a moment and a problem that we were going to get through.
Yep.
But as the weeks turned into months and, when after the summer, and then she was hospitalized, I'm going to say 3 or 4 more times that fall, my urgency around getting married diminished even further. And now it didn't have anything to do with the complexity of blending our families. It had to do with my dimming view of my own future and my reluctance to saddle Nick with a family that was going to be really different from what sort of looked like on paper. And my ability to work was suffering. And so I kind of felt that there was the person that I was in the courtship stage. I mean, this happens for a lot of people, a little bit of bait and switch, but
Right.
this I really didn't intend to go from being this kind of independent,
Yeah.
traveling, working, confident. I felt pretty good about myself at the time that he and I began our relationship, but I felt like I was personally plummeting so quickly that I questioned whether it was a good decision for him. I started to feel like I was maybe a bad bet. And it also was the case that Sarah was in the hospital and it just wasn't a very joyful time. So it didn't seem like getting married it wasn't something that we wanted to do right away. Um, but it's really been interesting and inspiring for me how loyal and constant and loving and supportive Nick has been because he eventually persuaded me that for better or worse, doesn't start the moment you get to the altar. It starts the moment you fall in love with someone and commit to being together. And he really seemed prepared uh, to be in it with me for the long haul. And so we did get married, which was incredible. I mean, it was really incredible when we finally did get married.
Yeah. Man, I just again, as I put myself in your shoes or try to, I would think every recurring trip to the hospital had to be like an additional 10x kick to the knees. That's why I would treat it like it's almost like this sense, and you talked about like dropping into this darkness or this despair and looking back and wanting to not be in that place. And I could see that like, I've kind of fallen off this cliff. I'm in this muck and I got to get back up on top, right, and get out of this. And so the idea of I want to go back to the way things were before the night happened where she had the lungs collapsing and I want to go back, I want to go back, and yet you can't go back, you just go forward. And every recurring, I would think, and tell me that every time you leave the hospital, it's got to be this feeling of joy, like, okay, we've graduated, we've been allowed to leave, we're going home. It's a shiny new day and a new opportunity, and we're getting better because they've let us leave. And then the idea that, oh, we have to go back. And you said 4 times.
Well, it was 6 times all in, but there were so many times when the readmission would happen the night of the discharge. So you wouldn't even sometimes get a full 24 hours. So you'd have these homecomings that, at first you've got balloons and
Mm,
cake and you're celebrating. And, after a few of these, you're just biting your nails. You're sitting outside the bedroom door. You're listening. I mean, it's it, you have your hopes dashed so many times that it almost feels logical. Like hopelessness becomes just like a rational position. It's not even, you're not being dramatic. It's just why bother hoping? Because every time you have a moment of progress, it's just as quickly erased. So
mm,
it's really hard to, um, you know, keep feeling hopeful. And I think about this a lot because, like, so it's 5 years now since everything began. And I have a lot more hope now than I did during some of those earlier years. But the reality is that Sarah is living with a chronic, serious mental illness, and that has changed everything about our lives and how we think about the future and how we plan even week to week. There's so much instability, so much uncertainty. Sarah's been home from the hospital for uh, 3 years, and that is fantastic. But we still work with a lot of instability
mm,
and a constant sense of at any moment things could crack.
mm.
And still, I feel more hopeful now than I have in a long time. And I think a big part of it is recognizing that, well, I do have this wonderful partner by my side, which that makes, I mean, I feel like you and Karen are kind of the gold standard of loving, committed, long-term relationships. But having Nick as my partner makes a lot of things more bearable. But I also have this dream of kind of telling people about our experience and kind of going through the worst of it and coming out the other side. And I find that inspiring enough that it gives me hope that we can help other people, which is
Yeah.
hugely important to me because back to that earlier thing I was talking about the isolation. I just think about how other people feel, and I can imagine it, and I know it because I felt it myself. And I think if there's any way that our story can help anyone else, then it feels a little more meaningful to me.
Right. Yeah. The I know there's parts of your story that I want you to share too, because so you talk about Sarah's been out of the hospital for 3 years. I see, and obviously pay attention to your social media and LinkedIn and so I see happy pictures of Sarah smiling, and you went to Europe. I know you took her to Europe. You might want to talk about that. So talk about how life has pivoted or evolved for you, because I see again when you look through the tiny little pinhole of social media, which can be so um, inaccurate, right? So you see these, and that's certainly not a novel thing to say. There's these ideas all the time that people are, the life you see on Instagram is not real, right? But so I see, but I believe yours is, right? So I believe that, so I see these happy pictures of Sarah. I believe they're real. Like, oh my gosh, look, she looks great. You're traveling with her, and you're obviously, you're not obviously, you're writing your memoir. You're writing your story and Sarah's story for all to understand as you look to help others dealing with the same issue. I know Sarah is aware of that.
Mhm.
So talk a bit about the the path that you're on now and some of those things, right? How you've
Yeah, I think, I
into
mean,
that.
it's interesting talking about going to Paris because you're right. I've always been a big poster, and I think I've posted even a lot more since Sarah's uh, become ill. And I think a big part of that before was almost from a place of defensiveness because I don't like the idea of people feeling sorry for, I don't, I don't want people to feel sorry for us. And so I think I maybe have over over indexed on like, look at our amazing lives. Like,
Right.
isn't everything going so great? And I posted last week about it's mental health, May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And so I've been posting some stories on LinkedIn and in my newsletter about sort of the story behind the pictures. And uh, I've been thinking a lot about how much our lives have been colored by uncertainty and emergency room visits and psychiatric evaluations and self-harm and calls from the school and a life interrupted almost all the time. I mean, it's constant. And yet, even with that as a backdrop, when we continue to have dreams that we can squeeze in between the crises, it is sort of sustaining in a way. And so the thing that I wrote about last week that seems to have resonated with a lot of people is that last spring, Sarah became very she she became much more fragile and a lot more prone to all of the self-destructive thoughts. And a few times it led to actions that led to emergency situations and ambulance rides and more psychiatric evaluations. And in April and May and even June, we were teetering on the brink of that she might be rehospitalized. And, you know, when she was in the emergency room and it just seemed like the right thing to do to rehospitalize her, it was so heartbreaking because it was like we'd gotten to the 2.5 year mark. She'd come so far, and it just had this heavy, heavy feeling of we're going to reset the clock.
Mm.
She's going to be hospitalized again. We don't know how long it will be. And when she comes out, we're back at the starting line. And she ended up not being rehospitalized. Um, I mean, it was essentially a bed shortage issue. I mean, if there had been an inpatient bed available, I think she would have gone. But we had been talking about going to Paris, and she really, really wanted to go. And she knew that she basically wasn't going to be eligible to go if she wasn't stable. And I'm not going to say that like willpower is the driving force, but a dream can be. And she was very, very motivated and really committed. And I was not sure that it was a good idea because it's hard enough to represent your kid's mental health history in our country, where I speak the language fluently. The idea of having a crisis in France and trying to navigate the French mental health hospital system was like, and it honestly was not that, it wasn't, again, these weren't like fantasy scenarios of like, oh, in the worst case scenario. This was very much part of our
Yeah,
experience. We
very
had
likely.
just been in an ambulance twice in the previous 12 weeks.
Yeah.
And we did it. We went, we stayed in my cousin's apartment. We were there for 3 weeks, and it was just Sarah and me. Nick came for the last 5 days. But I have to say, it was such an incredible experience, and it was such a confidence builder. not just for Sarah, but also for me, because it allowed both of us to imagine big things, have, what we used to say at work, like big, hairy, audacious goals. This was a really audacious goal. And I was scared and she was nervous and we did it. And it was just a reminder of set the next dream, set the next goal. It doesn't have to
Yeah.
be Paris, but just keep putting points on the horizon ahead of you. And it was a reminder to me that to be a good mother to Sarah, I have to have dreams for myself, that my dream can't be just taking care of her because it's too much pressure for her and it's too much pressure for me. So when I can allow myself to have grand ideas and ambitions and dreams, I can see that it's healthy and motivating for her.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. And so which leads me to the writing, right? So you left your corporate life behind at some point. At what point of this Sarah's?
Sarah had been home. So when she came home from the hospital, in my mind, it was like, well, again, okay, now we can resume our old life.
Yeah,
I didn't realize that, my old life was never coming back.
yeah,
And I also didn't realize that stable enough to come home is not the same thing as what life before was like.
right.
So after maybe 5 or 6 months of attempting to continue working full time and being on call for every emergency or situation, I left my job. And, you know, I mean, it was great that I wasn't working anymore, but it was a huge loss in terms of income, identity, structure,
Yeah.
all of the
Friend groups. I mean,
friend groups, social contact. I mean, the isolation that happens when you're not working and you're suddenly on the outside, and it's not that you're going to a new job, you're just waiting for the phone to ring for the next crisis. That's not a great place to be.
yep. So, so at what point do you think about writing and starting to tell this your story?
Yeah, so I didn't really think about that. I honestly, it's really hard for me to admit that I think I was depressed after a little while.
How could you not be? I mean, I don't know how you functioned through it all, right? I mean, I think I
Well,
would be
I think there's a hyper functioning. You're like hyper functioning, and that sort of it like keeps the depression at bay a little bit because like who has time to be depressed? You've got a client call, you've got to book
mm,
your travel, and then almost when I stopped working, it created a vacuum where the like reality and my feelings about all of this kind of it was like they caught up with me and overtook me. And then I really was pretty discouraged. And, not in a terrible, dark, dark way, but in a pretty sad way. And again, it was kind of like I had a snowballing effect because it compounded, the stuff that I was saying. Like Nick and I had just gotten married 6 months earlier. So it was like, yay, we got married. And now you have an unemployed, depressed wife. Like, like,
yay.
yay, lucky you.
Wow.
So, I felt pretty bad about that, but I also felt kind of powerless to do anything because in a way it was like I got dealt this hand and sorry, and I'm falling to the bottom of like an abyss and I just don't know. I don't know, it just wasn't a good time. And again, Nick is just he's so wonderful and he was very supportive and he never ever said like I have you thought about this or maybe you could try that. He never was sort of
Pushing.
telling me what to do. Um, but it maybe was like a year, it was probably a year and a half after I left that I And during that time, I didn't I didn't really have any ambitions except for the coaching. I think you and I might have talked briefly at some point about that. I thought about doing some coaching because I'd always, as a manager and a coach at work, I thought, well, maybe I could do that and just sort of fit it in here and there. Although I didn't have formal credentials to do it, but a lot of Jessica's
Good at
friends
it.
had leaned on me, and I was like,
Very good
"No,
at it. Yeah.
I'll do it. That's fine." Um, but then I ended up t sign the I signed up for an adult ed class, and it was like the writing the personal essay. And so I asked Nick if he wanted to do it with me, and he said no. And I asked a friend, and everyone said no. And I'll just, what else am I doing? I'm
The
just,
Tuesday night. Come on, let me go.
yeah, I'll go do it. And so I started writing these different personal essays, and they were kind of in a kind of funny way. They were sort of like a cat at the edge of a room, like just going around the edges, and then you'd read what you wrote, and people would say, well, what are you not saying? It seems like there's something else there. And I'd go, like, what? There's nothing else. This is a story about
Yeah.
a letter from my grandmother. It just
Yeah.
reminded me of so, and people encouraged me to, they kept saying, go deeper and write the things that you're afraid to say.
Yeah.
No, well, I don't want to do that. There's a reason I'm afraid. I don't
Yeah.
want to talk about this. But eventually I started to write about it. And eventually I wrote the story of that first night. And I started submitting things that I wrote to different literary magazines. And the story of that first weekend when Sarah became psychotic was accepted and published in a magazine. And when that happened, um, I didn't see it as the opening chapter of a story about the whole experience. I just saw it as one moment in time, one scene from our lives. But then eventually I started looking at how much I'd written during that time, in terms of updating friends and family and telling everyone what was going on. And I started to think there could be an actual coherent story here. And then I started writing it, and then I wrote it.
Right on. So, and Sarah is fully aware that you're writing the
Oh, yeah.
story
Yes.
and is
Yes. So when that chapter Unraveling was published, um, so literary magazines have it's not like publishing an Oprah or People magazine. Like no one's going to know about it unless you tell everyone you know about it. So the risk of it being public was pretty low. But I talked to Sarah about it before it was published. And then when it came out, I shared it with her and I read it actually out loud to her. And I mean, she was surprisingly, she was so pleased about the whole thing. She felt represented.
yeah.
And she started sharing the link to the story. She's actually like my PR gal because she's the biggest promoter. I mean, if she's at school, she shares it with the principal, the gym teacher, the
Wow.
English teacher. I mean, she's practically got business cards for me. And she's
Nice.
like, you want to hear my story? Here
Yeah.
it is. Click on this link. So she's really on board. And as it's kind of grown and blossomed, it's become something that has become a dream for her as well, in terms of so she has a dream about she wants to work in the field of mental health, and she wants to tell her story. And she is excited about the idea of going on book tours with me and being on stage with me and telling about her experience and having people ask her, is it weird having your mom write a book about your mental health eh, crisis?
Yeah.
What's that like? Did she check in with you? Did you feel like she got it all right? What would
Yeah.
you do differently? All that kind of stuff. So she's excited about it, and I feel like it almost has that virtuous circle effect of her energy about it feeds mine and
Yeah.
mine feeds hers, and it almost feels like we've got this like mutually healing kind of dynamic going on where When I lose heart or get discouraged, I remember how important it is for me to have my dream because my dream powers hers and then hers powers mine. And so it just keeps going like that.
Mm. I love it. Um, a couple questions come to mind. Uh, One is, what recommendations or experience would you share with a parent that's going through something similar? If they're in that first night or that first week, or they're trying to find that first ledge to crawl up on right out of some raging rapids that they're in, what would you say to them
Mhm.
now?
I think that the impulse to withdraw and isolate is a really natural one. It's such a shock to the system to find yourself in a situation that you never imagined or anticipated, and to contemplate your child's illness or future. It's pretty easy to fall down a rabbit hole there. When I look back, I think about the different people that reached out to me and offered support groups or to talk with a social worker at a hospital. And I declined almost every offer of help. And, I wish I hadn't because I think it deepened that sense of isolation. Um, I didn't join a support group until Sarah had been home for a couple years, I think. And I wish I had done that sooner. I, I think a big part of it was kind of like what you were saying earlier about when you don't want to admit there's a problem. I really didn't want to become a member of a community that wasn't my dream. Nobody
Mhm.
dreams about, it's like Nick and I were talking about when at his former employer, there are affinity groups for people that are, um, have this sexual orientation or that ethnicity, but there isn't usually a group for um, the parents of children who uh, have mental health issues or um, maybe dependent on their parents always or aren't, don't have a traditional future. And uh, it makes you feel alone. That's not a club anyone really wants to
Yeah.
join, but getting to connect with other families is it's really heartening because of this thing of common humanity. The understanding that we're not alone, and even though you might be struggling with acceptance of what your circumstances are, what your kid's condition, or any family member, having community is just really important. And it's important also for your immediate family, for them to see that you're getting support outside of them. I think it helps them.
Yeah, for sure. Um, what's your take on, or recommendations too, for again, for a parent to going through something similar? Your take on the hospital system, the medical system, the advice you were given by the medical community. Like you mentioned, at one point they were saying, "Hey, use your friend group to see if you can get into a hospital or find a children's mental facility with a bed." It's like, what? So, what's your recommendation on navigating the health system, or your take on the health system overall, having
Um,
going through what you're going through?
I mean, I have a pretty dim view. It's almost like there were 1,000 points of light in a sea of blackness. Just really, really fragmented. I think Sarah really suffered from the revolving door of care. I think the lack of continuity, the unwillingness of any given psychiatrist to take bold steps to uh, provide, to start her on a treatment that everyone was afraid of. Um, you know, I think the importance of advocacy, really knowing uh, what the available options for your kid are, and or whoever your family member is, and being a strong advocate. I feel like that's something that I wasn't always that good at. So when I look in the rearview mirror, I feel um, I wish I'd been more aggressive. A lot of what stopped me from being more, or maybe I should say assertive, um, there was a lot of co-parenting friction that was happening at that time. And Peter was very assertive. And I think I retreated in response to that. If he hadn't been part of the equation, I imagine I would have been more demanding, but I was more passive than I think I should have been. And so, my recommendation to other folks would be, do your homework, find out what the most effective treatments are for whatever your person is, and advocate for them. Push. It's really not in that pushing to get use your connections for the inpatient bed, but push for the right treatment. Do your homework and have more confidence in your own research than, I deferred too much. And I think that was a mistake.
Yeah. What about have you had experience with or seen any impact of things like her environment in terms of food, sleep, exercise, fresh air, any of those types of things go, oh, we see good outcomes when we're like you went to France. We had good outcomes when we traveled. When I look at those 14 days or 21 days of travel, all 21 days of good, right? Or was it, 12 days of
Oh
good?
yeah, no, it wasn't. I mean, that's the thing. It's like wherever you go, there you are. It's like you
Yeah,
go to Paris, your mental illness comes with you.
comes
It's not
with.
on. And actually, that's the next thing I'm about to post on LinkedIn is a story, an excerpt from the memoir that takes place in Paris. And uh, I think it's actually a really nice moment, but there are a few moments where, we don't end up in the hospital, but it's there. It's always there. It's hovering right there. So I wish, gosh, if there was a way you could, you know, um, plan something that would guarantee you some coverage. But in answer to your question, what we found the most positive relationship between, well, it's the simple, like plans, having things to look forward to, and they can be very small. I mean, the Paris thing is a kind of uh, it's a dramatic example because it's so big, but it can be um, like it's a lot. So this is a long weekend coming up. We don't have a lot of plans. So I think about, well, what is engaging to Sarah? What matters to her? She loves her counselor at school. Let's get her chocolate. Let's make an outing to go find the kind of chocolates that Lynn is going to like. That'll get her out of bed. That'll motivate her. So it doesn't have to be we're going to have a go clamming or
Right, right.
have,
Some big thing.
go to do some big thing. It can be as little as um, sometimes it's as simple as uh, should we have pancakes on Sunday morning? Let's do it at 11. Okay, so we're getting up to have pancakes. Our lives have gotten so small. So it's or you're going to play a game of horse with Nick. Let's see if you can beat him 2 of 3. Just really little things, but things that are planned.
Yeah. Do you see if you look for positive things out of this, right? And I desperately don't want to be trite or try to put some bow on something, but do you see what just struck me there when you talk about pancakes or games and doing things like that? Do you see now like, man, I appreciate things like pancakes on Sunday, whereas in the past when I was hustling and traveling around the world or the country, work and kids and stuff and acquiring, and I was blowing by a lot of small things that I appreciate now. Is that a
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, Nick's constancy allows me to appreciate how the pleasures of like quotidian life. So we live on a farm now and we have chickens and we
which is
get
hilarious?
immense pleasure
Back to your
from.
country roots right there.
Yeah, yeah,
Back to Kentucky.
exactly. Just what my parents always wanted for
Always dreamt for you.
us. We're farmers.
We're farmers. I have chickens. No.
I mean, we literally will talk about, I saw a groundhog yesterday. Where'd you see it? Well, let's see if we can find its den, and we get pretty excited about this stuff. And it's, you know, none of it takes away this very serious backdrop, which is this is a chronic condition for Sarah, which means it's a chronic condition for us. And we can't change that. So, our best bet is at finding a way to live inside it that still gives us a sense of satisfaction and even accomplishment um, because it feels good to get things done. It feels good to, you know, have your chickens live through the winter and
Yeah.
not be frozen to death.
Right.
It feels good to feel competent at some things. And the writing has been really gratifying in that way because, I mean, yesterday I was at Whole Foods and this lady called out to me across the parking lot, Hannah. And I look over at this lady, I have no idea who she is. She was the executive assistant to Jonathan Bush when we worked at Athena 25 years ago. And she said, and I hadn't seen her in this long. And she said, I recognized you because I've been following your writing on LinkedIn. You're doing a great job. Keep at it.
Wow.
And it was my first time that
Yeah.
I'd been spotted by someone who was following along with the story. And I was so, gosh, it was really gratifying. It was
Yeah.
really just it was nice to see her, but it was also nice to know um, that the writing is making a difference to some people and that some people are reading it and it matters. So that feels really good. No.
Yeah, for sure. And I read your writing I see your LinkedIn posts and the comments and you definitely see people appreciating you being so vulnerable, sharing a very vulnerable story. I think you mentioned at some point earlier in our conversation about wanting to hide certain things. Like, oh, I don't want that to come out. I want to keep that, close to the vest. And the fact that you're willing to share this story and show vulnerability and that rawness is what resonates with people because they see their own life in that honesty, right? And then they can learn from it, and it also builds that sense of community. Like, oh, I'm not alone. Here's someone else that's educated and has had all and many advantages in life, and yet look, she's dealing with something really, really hard that she didn't choose, and so there's hope for me, or I can learn something from you, and so it's awesome that you're writing that you're writing and writing about it. Um, you
It's
mentioned,
scary. I have to say, it is scary. Sometimes I feel like, oh gosh, is it okay for me to say this stuff and tell this story? And then I think, well, the that sense of stigma grows in silence.
yeah,
And I feel that by telling some of the most painful and worst stories, it's almost an act of self-compassion too, because it's a way of saying, you know, that I accept this about myself and our family and our lives, and I'm telling our story, So but it is really. Sometimes I work, I'll ask my older kids, did you read that? Is it okay? And uh, they seem to think it's okay. So
I think keep leaning into. I think when you're telling personal stories and things, some people's feelings are going to get hurt, right? Potentially, but I think as long as, but it's my take for whatever it's worth. You know, if you're okay and Sarah's okay, that's what matters, right? Because I think that story coming out is what's really so powerful to others. You talked earlier on the show. You mentioned the hero's journey, right? And I've talked about the hero's journey on this show many, many times. Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey is how a great story is told, and we live our own hero's journey. Each one of us has a hero's journey that we're on.
yes.
The first part of the hero's journey is the resistance to the call, right? A
Mm.
hero is called to step out of whatever life that he or she is in, and they resist. And all great story again told along the path or the journey of the hero. Luke Skywalker, Harry Potter, all the hero's journey, and they resist initially, and then they go into the darkness
Mhm.
and they stumble around and they skin their knees and they don't know what's going on. They find a mentor or a guide to help them, and then eventually they fight the big baddie and they win that battle. They figure out, they find the elixir, the thing they're supposed to bring back to the
Right.
light.
Hmm.
They bring that thing back to the light and it makes the world better.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so you think about your hero's journey that you're on, and it's like this is not a path you would have chosen. You've been in the darkness, you've been bumping around, you're maybe still in some degree bumping around and trying to figure out. But I believe, and this is just my take, is your storytelling and your ability to show empathy, compassion, hope with to others that are going through challenge is you are enabled to do that now that you never would have been before this happened, right?
That's right. That's exactly right.
You had no right to be and to reflect that and to have those and to add value there that you now do have a right because of your own life experiences, as long as you're willing to share it. And
Mhm.
the whispering, and I go to my faith component where I hear like, when you hear that whisper saying, "Oh, I shouldn't tell this story, maybe I should keep this to silent." To me, that's like the devil going, "We don't want Hannah sharing this story because it's going to make the world better. It's going to add light to somebody's life, and so we want to whisper in her ear, don't do it, right? Keep it to yourself because people will you'll embarrass someone, you'll hurt someone's feelings, you'll bring shame to yourself or your family, so keep it quiet." And I just it's like, man, when you hear that voice, it's like lean into it. As long as you're true to yourself and true to your daughter, to me, keep going. Um, it's super inspiring.
That's
And
nice to hear, Eric. Thank you. It's really I mean, I want to say it feels like a hero's journey, but I don't want to call myself a hero. But it does feel like it follows that paradigm because, the way I think about the writing is uh, I I didn't think I was a writer, but I always knew I was a storyteller. And I just didn't have a story that was big enough to tell until the experience happened with Sarah. And so it feels like a convergence of our circumstances, my storytelling, this moment in our lives, and my desire to bring that message to the world of that even when our lives deliver circumstances or setbacks or hardships, um, and even when we have to confront the fact that we're never going to get our old lives back, that we can still find a way to create a life alongside or inside that new life that can still be a source of joy, and hope and satisfaction. And that's the part that feels meaningful to me.
right on. Where can people find you? Where can people keep up with your work? All the
Sure. Well, thanks for asking. So I'm on LinkedIn and I post quite a bit and I post excerpts from the memoir and I write newsletters about sort of what I'm thinking about. In addition to writing, I'm a big reader. And so oftentimes I'll write about reflections on what I'm reading and of course how everything ties back to the Sarah story. So on LinkedIn, and then also on my website, I post different essays that have been published, and actually that's a mix of things. I don't know if I know you've read some of them, but um, most of them aren't about Sarah. But the first chapter of the memoir is on my website, which is hannahbottigheimer.com.
HannahBottigheimer.com, and I'll put that link in the show notes. And then also LinkedIn has had it, Hannah Bottigheimer. Any other places, or are those the good best?
Oh, I'm on Instagram as Hannah Bottigheimer Writes, uh, and Substack, but I just feel anemic on Substack, so I don't think that's the place to go. I think LinkedIn is actually the best place.
LinkedIn and your website.
Mhm.
and a little bit of IG. Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. What a fantastic conversation. I know I have many other questions in my head. We could keep going. At the same time, I know on the East Coast where you are, it's getting late. And so we should look to wrap up. But what a great conversation, Hannah. Thank you so much for being on the show. So enjoyed the conversation. And maybe we do a part 2 at some point. This was great.
I'd love to. This is so much fun and such a fun opportunity to catch up with you and reminisce about old times and both of us being negligent parents.
It's so true. Absolutely. So thank you again, Hannah. And to all the listeners out there, thank you so much for taking time from your busy day to listen to the show. Always appreciate that you do that. If you could leave us a nice rating, write a review, share the program with a friend, it helps us reach a broader audience. Until next time, friends, I'm Eric Sardina. You've been listening to the Return to Authenticity podcast, and bye for now.